I'm Alan Kumamoto, and I was born in Los Angeles, in Little Tokyo. And basically, at the beginning of World War II, I was removed with my family to Santa Anita Racetrack as an assembly center, and then we went to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, for the concentration camp there, or relocation center. We then waited in Chicago when the camps were closed because my dad was in the U.S. Army in military intelligence. So we had to wait, and then we came from Chicago back to Los Angeles. So that's sort of my life story. English is my second language because in the camps I spoke a type of Japanese that belonged to the Issei grandparents. So it's not pure Japanese, but it's the Japanese of the Meiji era that my grandparents knew. So my Kumamoto family, they came from Hiroshima, and they were farmers. So they have what's called a tampo, which is a rice field that they have as part of a co-op up there. They came primarily to the U.S. to farm and get rich and return to Japan. They settled in an area of Los Angeles called Tropico. Tropico is basically Glendale, California. And Tropico, in fact, there's a U.S. post office called Tropico Station. So that's where they were. But the ground was hard and there were a lot of rocks and so forth. So eventually they gave up on the farming and they moved to Little Tokyo, which was the only area where many people can settle. And at that time they set up a boarding house. So boarding house is something that was pretty full during the weekends because all the farmers in the area would come in, or laborers on the farms would come in and spend the weekend in Little Tokyo. And during the weekday, some people would be there, but not as many. So it was pretty hectic on the weekends and so forth. On my mom's side, and they lived just around the block, so they were just down the street. That was the Suski family. And Suski, Peter Marie Suski, he came from basically Tokyo and Kyoto. He was married and he was a Catholic, converted in Japan. And when they came to the US, he came to work on photographic plates for Zeiss Icon, the German photography people. And after the earthquake of 1907, he went across the bay to Oakland to avoid all the disease and things that were happening in the city. And eventually, in order to, again, to avoid all the after effects of the earthquake, he wanted to move to Los Angeles. So he came down to Los Angeles. He set up a photography store around where Parker Center is. And he befriended the editor and the owner of the Rafushimpo newspaper. So he was doing photography and touch-ups, and people who were non-Japanese didn't want to go east of Los Angeles Street because that was the ghetto. So he was having a hard time, and so he was translating Japanese into English for the Rafushimpo newspaper. And so he was going back and forth. In fact, one of his daughters eventually became the first English editor of the Rafushimpo, Louise Suski. And I'm not sure whether she went to UCLA or whether she went to SC, but she never completed her education because she became the editor and so forth. And when the camps occurred, she went to camp and she was working on the Heart Mountain Sentinel. And she continued to do that. The other thing that's interesting about both of those grandparents is my grandfather, Kumamoto, was part of the Nishi Honganji the Japanese Buddhist temple. And so he was active in that church. Whereas the Suski side, that were the Catholics, helped to get Marino started in Little Tokyo. Marino is an order of Irish Catholic priests who, because their missionaries were in Japan, so he knew about that order. And when he was asking for somebody who was Japanese speaking to help to minister to the Japanese, that order was able to send a priest. And so that's how Marino Catholic Church started in Little Tokyo. He was part of a committee, but I mean, you know, that. So that's sort of the family history there. My dad went to USC, became a pharmacist. In fact, my grandfather on the Suski side went to USC, and in 1913 he got a medical degree. So he became a physician with 7 children. He went to night school. So, you know, but then he couldn't practice because none of the hospitals would allow Japanese physicians to practice. So they had to set up a clinic and so forth. And he was basically practicing at LA County General. So he had Mexican patients, and a lot of his patients, whether they were Japanese or Mexicans, would pay him in goods and services and not so much money. But he was more of an intellectual, and he was more of a person who would study kanji and Chinese and so forth. So he wrote books on those types of things. My other grandfather, again, you know, was running the boarding house and so forth. So his son, my dad, went to USC and became a pharmacist. But when he became a pharmacist, he could only work in Little Tokyo because there weren't jobs available in the mainstream community. So that's sort of the history, early beginning and so forth. One of the things we were mentioning was the Suskis, and the Suskis had 7 children. My grandfather and grandmother had 7 children. He goes to USC and gets a doctor's degree. Well, what happens to the children? We mentioned one of the girls became the English editor of the Rafashimpo newspaper. The other girl becomes a Nisei Week queen. And the third, the oldest one, actually marries a Disney cartoonist who's working with Walt Disney on Hyperion and so forth. So they all have, you know, different varied interests and so forth.
Not Tyrus Swan.
But no. Okay. But the last 2 are boys. And one of the boys is called Joe Suski, and he goes to UCLA because all the boys used to play for the Olivers. The Olivers is an organization that was created by Mrs. Oliver, and she felt that the children of these Japanese immigrants needed to learn U.S. manners. So she insisted that they dress up, that they were polite and escorted her, for instance, to the bus stop, that they knew how the forks and knives and spoons were set at a table and so forth. So that was her big contribution. However, she organized them by different grades into sports teams. So the boys played sports, the girls were sort of the cheerleaders, and that was the era. Wow. And so Joe was good in baseball. My dad also played for the Olivers and so forth. And eventually he got a scholarship to UCLA. This is Joe Suski. He becomes a lifetime member at UCLA, and so he had an athletic pass to all athletic events at UCLA, which he gave up, sadly. And so sometimes I get to go to UCLA football games, even though my dad, who had gone to USC, bought season tickets to USC. So who do you root for during the SC-UCLA game? Well, the answer is a mystery.
You don't know the answer either. Wow.
I don't want to start a family controversy. So my education, yes. Actually, I went to Loyola High School. I was the first from my little Catholic school to go to Loyola High School, which is a private Jesuit school. Then I went on to Loyola University before it became Loyola Marymount University. And I was on the board of visitors when that occurred for Loyola. I went to USC for grad school because my uncles and everybody else had gone there too. So my dad and my grandfather. So I was destined to go there. So my period at UCLA was limited, but I had two people that I would go and visit. One was Joe Grant Masaoka, who was the administrator for the Japanese American History Project, or Japanese American Research Project. And I believe Yuji Ichioka wrote some things about that and so forth. But Joe was active with the JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League, was a regional director in Utah. He helped to start the Northern California office as a regional director. And he and I got together when I became National Youth Director for the Japanese American Citizens League. And so I would go, and he's the one who actually got me involved in this idea of an Asian American Study Center. And the other person that I would go and visit would be Harry Kitano, Dr. Kitano. And there's another interesting path there because Harry Kitano, what I call the big three. Harry Kitano was the academic. Then there was a Mike Suzuki, who was a social worker who became the director of JACS, Japanese American Community Services, which, again, it's sort of an odd situation because my Uncle Joe was the chair of the board of the Shonin, which was the children's orphanage, which gave up their property to give to the Japanese American Community Services. They wanted to, they said that there weren't enough kids around who needed to have a home. So they transferred the assets and created JACS, Japanese American Community Services. And that's what Mike Suzuki was in charge of. Mike Suzuki later goes on and he becomes part of the federal government and so forth. The third part of that, the third person in that is Jerry Umemoto. Jerry Umemoto becomes part of the JACL, but the three of them, Mike, Jerry, and Harry Kitano, all went to UC Berkeley together. And they all got their masters together in social work. And so they all knew each other, and I coincidentally knew each of them in a different way. And Jerry was my National Youth Commissioner, becomes national president. He helps to chair the redress movement, and et cetera, et cetera. He becomes the first appointed department head for the Department of Corrections under Jerry Brown, the first time that Jerry Brown was governor. And he becomes the first Asian American to become a U.S. Marshal out of Washington, D.C. So, I mean, anyway, it's interesting that these big three who knew each other, I also knew in different capacities. And this was all around the same time as the beginning of the study center. The main person who dragged me into this thing was Joe Grant, because the whole idea was there were faculty, Harry Kitano, there were students, and then there were administration people, and there was an administrator, and then there were community people. Well, I was one of the, I don't remember how many community people there were, but I know I was one of the community people. So that's why I didn't have the tie. But my involvement with these other people were part of my community involvement. So, and they were all cheering for Harry, because Harry, at one point or another, Kitano, had always tried to get me, when I was National Youth Director, to have JCL apply for a grant to help me with my youth programs. And the JACL statement was something like, when we can't have our members raise the funds to do our programs, we should go out of business. So they didn't want to accept that tainted federal money that Harry Kitano was good at getting for mental health and some of these others. And so that was my connection with Harry and so forth. And as you know, Harry became one of the interim executive directors of the center and so forth. What's interesting too, though, is that Don Nakanishi, as a student, as a high school student, he wanted to come and see me. So when I was youth director, we spent an afternoon together. And he wanted to go to this place called Yale out on the East Coast, and he had been accepted. And he was trying to decide whether to go there or someplace else, more locally. And I told him, go east, young man, go east. And he said, well, it's so far, and all that kind of thing. And I think the rest is history in terms of what happened to Don and where he eventually ended up. But he was a fine young man at the time. And so that's my Don Nakanishi story. And I never let Don forget it, and he never forgot it. So the other connection is actually, there was at the time, we were all Orientals. We weren't Asians yet. So there was a Council of Oriental Organizations. Most all of the ethnic groups were divided by their ethnicity. So the Japanese had their groups, the Chinese had their groups, etc. So likewise, I was involved mainly in a lot of Japanese groups, Japanese American groups. However, there was a Council of Oriental Organizations. And that was the beginning of having coalitions with other Asian groups, or APIs right now, or whatever you want to use as new terms and so forth. But Council of Oriental Organizations, the one thing that happened in 1970 on the UCLA campus was we had Act One. Act One means Asians coming together for the first time.
It's clever.
And so that was the first time that we had Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Filipino, because those were the big four that were identified in the census. And we had another group called Asian Indians, because the Indians wanted to figure out, since the Japanese had Nisei Week and the Chinese had their festivals, how could they get their elephant permit for their parade?
Elephant permit? Like
an actual, yeah, like an actual elephant in their parade. These are Indians from India. So we said, well, come join us and we'll tell you, kind of thing. So that was one of the first times we had that, the Southeast Asians and some of the others looking at us, and the South Asians.
You were there, right, for the first one?
Oh yeah, I was chair of Act One.
How was it? How was the atmosphere?
We had it at the Student Center primarily. It was through Extension. And I mean, it was cordial. I mean, everybody was being polite and nice and so forth. And it was the first time, so I don't remember all the topics and things, but usually they were around, some of the common issues that were occurring at the time. So you have to also understand that the social and political environment at that time this is around the time of the Vietnam War. This is, there's social and civic unrest. You have Ronald Reagan as governor. You have LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, as the president. So, you've got the war on poverty, some of these other expressions and so forth. So that was a time in which the Japanese were being mistaken as foreigners. I think we still are. And so what's the distinction between being Japanese and being Japanese Americans? And so even Japanese Americans, you're foreigners. your international students, right? That type of thing. So the Asian terms, some of these things were just all foreign to people, including Orientals, as we were called. So that was sort of that environment and time in which we find ourselves. So we had this committee, like I said, mainly faculty, and then there were, as I recall, there were 2 or 3 faculty, 2 or 3 students, 1 administration person, and as I recall, I knew I was one of maybe 1 or 2 community folks. I think Joe Grant was part of, he might have been the other community person because as the administrator of the project, I don't know if he was considered faculty, and I don't think he was considered administration. So we had a non-Asian administrator from the chancellor's office or the president's office, and the impression I had was that they were willing to bend over backwards to help us with this proposal, and so they would help to write it up. So we would have, we probably met 2 or 3 times, and at the end of those meetings, they would have the notes and so forth. And this person would take it back, write it up, and so when we had the final, quote, proposal, that's the one we were all supposed to sign and agree and so forth. Well, I noticed one funny thing. There was an indirect cost item. So our $100,000 proposal had this amount on it. And so it was like 20% was for the proposal and 80% was for the administration that went to UCLA. So there was an indirect cost rate, and we're going, well, shouldn't it be reversed? But that was something that was pre-negotiated between UCLA and the federal government. So, you know, that was sort of a big surprise. The other thing that occurred, maybe not then, but a little later, was when we were trying to, we actually got the grant, was to try to find the director. So you have faculty, and we're looking for faculty to not volunteer, but to apply to become the director of this new Asian Studies Center. Well, we had a heck of a time because in the politics of the campus, it's publish or perish. If you're going to get tenure, if you're going to advance in the system and so forth, you're going to be respected by your colleagues. You know, you needed to be on the tenure track. Being a center director is sort of going to the side and just being sort of a support person. And so that was sort of the political reality of why it was difficult to get tenured people to actually want to continue to be a center director and not just go on the academic track. So that was another sort of big realization and so on. But UCLA was cooperative as long as they got their percentage. It was a shock, but then at the same time, if you think about Boeing or you think about Hughes Aircraft or any of those, and when they get all these big defense contracts, it's more than 100% in terms of indirect cost. So the $100,000 item that you have, you might get $120,000, you know, or more in indirect costs. So it becomes a way of compensating the institution for their costs, for research and development, for their whatever, paper clips, and so forth. So, I mean, I guess from being a polite Asian standpoint, that's the way it is. Is it right? Well, that's the way the formula is. So we got to change the formula.
Yeah, but they still take a percentage now. So.
Right, and it's probably 64%, but I think, I don't remember what the exact percentage was. It was, I thought it was 82% or so, something really high in my mind.
Yeah.
There was a Chinese guy that I don't remember his name, and that's where we always had to rely on Harry, who was, Harry was, to me, the instrumental person that I knew who was pushing for this behind the scenes and so forth. And he's not a real outright aggressive person, so he was doing it in his own way. And I think, I don't remember whether he was the first and he had to do it on an interim basis until we found the permanent, or whether or not we found a person who lasted for a little bit and then decided after a year or so that this wasn't the right fit. So, but that was just those kind of things in terms of that institution and the way the institutions behave, kind of thing. But that was the environment that we were in. Now, I had gone to private schools, so the only thing that spoke there was money, because I started the Asian support group. Asian Student Services had a support group that we created to support Asian American student services, which were services in the 80s to USC students. And they didn't think that there were any problems, or you know, Asians are all successful. It's the minority myth. It's the idea that we're not just successful, but we don't have social problems. You know, kids aren't committing suicide. The highest suicide rate at the time were Asian students graduating out of San Marino High School and committing suicide after their first year in college, because all of a sudden they found out they weren't white, and they found out that going to some of these campuses, it was segregated. You know, there were the lunch group that hung out over here or over there, and you were either part of the ethnic groups or you were part of the mainstream groups. And if you weren't a jock, you probably wouldn't fit into the mainstream group, that type of thing. So, you know, I'm sure that goes on here today, but not to the same degree, but that was then. And USC was like that. I mean, you have the fraternity and system, and a lot of the Asians created their own fraternities and sororities because they couldn't get into the mainstream ones and so forth. I mean, that's what was happening at UCLA, because we would go to the dances and so forth that the sororities would put on, and they were the Asian students' sororities. The thing that's interesting is I was bouncing between ethnic and mainstream organizations. So when I started out, I was working for an international Japanese corporation for a couple of years, and then I worked for the Japanese American Citizens League for 5 as their national youth director. And that's both a mainstream organization as well as being a ethnic group. And it's one of the more successful Asian civil rights groups, I would say. But there's still a long ways to go and so forth. And, I worked for the Human Relations Commission, and I worked for the National YMCA and so forth. And the thing that intrigues me is the fact that we never learn, that we keep going, we take one step backwards every time we take a couple of steps forward and so forth. When I mentioned Mike Suzuki and Jax, we spent money creating the Asian Involvement Office, which is the office that was across the hall in what was called the Sun Building, where Pioneer Center, the Chamber of Commerce, and all these other Japanese groups were. And Asian involvement, that's where Yellow Brotherhood, where a lot of the other non-conforming Asians were all located and so forth. And it's good that at least in the Asian community, it seems that there are always some elders who want to support at least the craziness of the younger people. And as long as we have that combination, I think we'll be successful. The study center, I think, is a good experiment because at the same time we had the Latino Center or the Chicano Center, the African American Center. And what was really interesting is going in Campbell Hall and seeing all these different study centers. And it's a euphemism, study center. You know, what's the purpose of a study center? When I was involved with United Way, we had to start an Asian Pacific planning and research group so that we could collect data, so we could give to United Way, the non-Asians, data that there were Asians, and these were the numbers, and these were the problems, and we could document it and so forth. So, you know, times have not changed. We still need the studies. A study center, we still need the publications. We still need bodies of data. And that's what this whole United States relies on. So we'll see, but I think it's been a good experiment. And I'm glad it's still going on.